to see this prayer of David, but I'd kind of like to set the scene a little bit with chapters 20 through 22. 23 is interesting because you've got David in a time of significant need, a need for direction from God, going to God in prayer multiple times to see what God would want him to do. In the 3 chapters that precede that, though, to me, what strikes me as interesting is there's multitudes of occasions where he should have done the same thing, and yet in each circumstance, I don't see him anywhere going to the Lord for counsel, for direction. And so, just to set the stage, you've got David on the run from Saul, right? This is early in the process. You've got in chapter of 1 Samuel, you've got chapter 17, 16, he's anointed king. 17, and at the end of that chapter, he goes and plays for Saul, who has the distressing spirit. Chapter 17, he defeats Goliath. Chapter 18, everybody loves David and ascribes to him great praise. And Saul gets a little bit miffed because he's king and everybody ought to love him. Why is everybody directing their attention to David, right? And so chapter 19, you've got Saul persecuting David. And so you are just leading into this 10-year process where David's going to be on the run for his life. It's not yet time for him to ascend to king, and so 10 years where it's going to be a mess from a human perspective. So it's just kicking into high gear in chapter 20, 21, and 22, and then when we get to chapter 23. But in chapter 20, it's interesting because in these 4 times when David should have run to the Lord asking for his direction and he failed to do so, the first one's interesting because it's that whole account where Saul's trying to kill David. And you've got this pact, right, made between David and Jonathan. And Jonathan is going to go and see these things as far as his dad, if he's really out to get David or not. And you've got that whole occurrence with the arrows and everything shot to determine whether or not he's staying or he's going. And so what strikes me as interesting in chapter 20 is you've got multiple opportunities when David could have gone to the Lord and asked for direction, asked for protection, and yet he runs to his friend Jonathan and asks Jonathan to come to his defense, asks Jonathan to figure things out for him. When it becomes obvious that Saul is out to kill David, David flees from the presence of Saul. Chapter 21, where does he go? Okay, eventually to Gath. Where does he go at the start of the chapter? Okay, he goes there to the priest, right, to Ahimelech the priest. Read with me verse 1. And David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid when he met David, and said to him, "Why are you alone, and nobody's with you?" So David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king ordered me on some business, and said to me, 'Do not let anyone know the thing about the business on which I sent you, or which I've commanded you, and I have directed my young men to such and such a place.'" So first, David goes to Jonathan and asks him for help. The second place he flees is to the priest. And what's his response to the priest when he shows up? A lie. That seems insane to me, right? He goes to the man of God who could have gone to God on behalf of David, and instead of asking for direction from the Lord, David comes up with his own ingenious plan to protect his backside. And so he lies to the priest. He gets the bread for his men so they can eat. And yet there is no account in there of David going to the Lord. So he goes to his friend, he goes to the priest, but he doesn't go to God in either of those instances. And so the third place, you go down to verse 10, and the third place he goes is to Gath, right? So David arose and fled that day from before Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s?'" So David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them, pretended madness in their hands, scratched on the doors of the gate, let his saliva fall down his beard. And Achish said to his servants, "Look, you see the man's insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of madmen? You have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence. Shall this fellow come into my house?" So David therefore departed and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So you've got him going to Jonathan, you've got him going to the priest, and then you've got him going to the enemy, right? Stupid. Of all places that you would not expect David to go, why shouldn't he go to Gath? Right, the Philistines, right? They are not going to think highly of him. Why was Israel singing the praises of David that they reference there? Well, because they just killed the mighty warrior of the land. And so now he goes there and he realizes, well, that was a stupid move. Well, I guess maybe I shouldn't have done this one. And so he pretends insanity there in the process, right? And he pulled it off. Extreme lengths that he went to protect his life in that moment. Until finally, chapter 22, he comes to the cave of Adullam. It says there, and everyone who was in distress, verse 2, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. Sweet, right? I mean, just the people you want to show up for help in that moment. Everybody else who's got a problem, everybody else who is discontent gathers to David. I mean, that's just who you want in that moment to encourage you, right? And yet that's who's attracted to David in this moment. And so he became captain over them. Well, rah, you go, right? And in all four of those instances, what should have been the obvious instant response of David, as I see it, seems to be far from whatever crosses his mind. And in none of those cases does he call out to God and ask for direction. Now it's interesting, verse 5, God finally gives him direction even though he didn't ask for it, right? The prophet Gad said to David, don't stay in the stronghold, get out, go to the land of Judah. So he departed and went into the forest. And then you've got this whole account of the mess that was created with the priest and his family because of David fleeing there in the first place. And you've got this whole destruction there that happens to the priests by Saul because of that connection that David had initiated that he never should have initiated in the first place. And so he goes to great lengths to figure out his own sense of direction and his own answers, and each time it's a huge fail. Each time it's a huge problem that's created in the process. But the good news is you get to chapter 23 and you see these prayers of David. And specifically in the first 12 verses, you see it come up over and over again. So, verse 1, and they told David, saying, chapter 23, look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah, and they are robbing the threshing floors. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. Now that's a striking difference from the previous three chapters, right? The previous three chapters, I've got to figure this out. I've got to do what makes sense, and so I'm going to pursue after what makes sense. I'm not going to stop and ask the Lord. I'm going to ask my friend. I'm going to ask the priest. I'm going to go to the enemy, and then I'm just going to flee and hole up where nobody else can find me. But finally, he comes to his spiritual senses and finds out the Philistines are attacking Keilah. They're robbing the threshing floors, and so David, in this moment of determining what he should do, goes to God and asks the obvious question, should I go and attack these Philistines? And God gives him, but let's see. And the Lord said to David, verse 2, go and attack and save Keilah. Now that seems pretty clear cut, right? Finally you've done the right thing. Finally you've gone to the Lord. Finally you've asked. Verse 3, what's the response of that discontented group of people that's with David? What's that? Yeah, they're afraid. Are you sure about this? Should we really go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah? I mean, they sit back. Now remember, they're discontent. They're in debt. They're in distress. I'm sure the thoughts on their mind aren't, oh, let's rally around David and go to battle. And yet that's what David is telling them they're going to do. We're very afraid here in Judah, it says, how much more than if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? So verse 4, what's David's response? He doesn't back down. He doesn't get squeamish. He goes to God again and says, what should we do? And the Lord answers and says, go, arise, go to Keilah, for I will deliver the Philistines into your hand. And David and his men went to Keilah and fought the Philistines, struck them with a mighty blow, and took their livestock. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. When he'd gone to Ahimelech, in his own thinking, in his own knowledge, in his own wisdom, it ended up with the destruction of all the priests. It ended up with Saul routing them because David had left them vulnerable, right? But when David goes before the Lord and seeks the Lord's direction, God puts him exactly where he wants him to be, exactly when he wants him to be there, and accomplishes the exact purpose that he desired to accomplish through David. So verse 6, it happened when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah, that he went down with an ephod in his hand. And Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah. Got to be careful how you say that. That sounds a lot like tequila. So Saul said, God has delivered him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. So Saul thinks he's got him, right? David thinks he's all smart and everything else, but boy, he's stuck. There's no way he's getting out now. So Saul calls, verse 8, for all the people to come together for war, to go down to Keilah, to besiege David and his men. When David knew that Saul plotted evil against him, he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. And David said, O Lord God of Israel, your servant has certainly heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city for my sake. Will the men of Keilah deliver me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord God of Israel, I pray, tell your servant. So what are the questions in that prayer that David asks God? What are the questions he asks? Is Saul coming? And what's the second one? Will I be betrayed? Should the people of Keilah ever thought for a second about turning David over to Saul? Not for a second. He had just saved their hide from the Philistines. They should have rallied around him and his band of men and been ready to defend him against Saul. And yet David understands, he reads between the lines, right? He hears Saul might be coming. He doesn't trust these people at Keilah, even though he has just gone to bat for them. And so he goes to God with those two questions. And God says, Saul will come down, verse 11. Verse 12, David said, will the men of Keilah deliver me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, yep, they'll deliver you. So David and his men, about 600, arose and departed from Keilah and went wherever they could go. And it was told Saul that David had escaped from Keilah, so he halted the expedition. It's interesting to me. What question didn't David ask the Lord in that prayer? Okay, yeah, what else? What else could David or should David maybe even have asked in that account? Is Saul coming? Yes. Will the men of Keilah betray me? Yes. What would you think would be the logical next question? What should I do? Where should I go? Right? It doesn't say that he asked that question. Possibly he did. But David stayed in the strongholds in the wilderness and remained there in the mountains, right? And so you see almost the roller coaster like our temperatures have been this week, right? Horrible decision making on the part of David when he just on his own makes those decisions, does what seems best. So he goes to his trusted friend, he goes to the priest. Neither of those work out very well, so maybe I'll just try what doesn't make sense and get out of Dodge and go to the enemy before just holding up, hoping nobody would find him. In none of those cases, he goes to the Lord. But when he finally comes to his senses and he asks God for direction, what does God give him? Obvious direction. Last week we saw in Joshua a confident prayer of hope and trust, asking God to do the impossible. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. One of the songs, I was just humming it. Oh, we just sang it, I think, on Sunday, or recently anyway. Encouraging us not to go to God with small requests, because we've got a big God. Large petitions with you bring. What's the song? For strength and power much, you can never ask too much. Oh, great God, right? Of highest heaven. That idea that we can go to God asking Him to work in ways that seem beyond reason. He may or may not choose to answer in those ways, but we do have a God who can accomplish what seems to be impossible to us. And so to go with it, go to Him, seeking those kind of answers, seeking those kind of responses. For David, it wasn't asking here in this section for God to do the impossible. It was simply asking God to deliver, for God to bring relief. And what does God answer? Yeah, get out of here. Your life's on the line. You need to go. Yes, they're coming to get you. Yes, go up to the Philistines and attack. It may not make sense, but do it. Trust me. And so when David goes to God asking for deliverance, God gave that clear answer. Deliverance, direction, however you want to look at that. There was a definite need in the moment. David went to God, and God gave him a specific answer. And I think about for you and me, so often we default to the same response as David. We do what makes sense, right? We've been saved a while. We've seen God work in the past, so surely what he's been using in his word is just going to make it obvious what I should do right now. And this one just seems open and shut, clear cut, so I'm just going to do. And we don't stop and say, Lord, is this what you want me to do in this moment? Right? It's easy to jump at what makes sense. For Mike, it would have been easy after 6 months of being laid off work to jump at the first opportunity that presented itself, right? But to pray and seek the Lord's direction. Probably the same thing for Brian after being laid off from work. The temptation will be the first thing that comes, I'm going to grab. But for us to stop in those moments and say, God, is this what you want for me? Those are big decisions. Those are the ones where maybe it's more obvious to us to ask, right? But every decision that faces us each day, asking God for his clear direction for what he wants us to do next. Not what makes sense, but God, what do you want in this moment? And trust that he's going to provide those answers. And so, it's not our magic lamp where we rub it and all of a sudden, here it is, it's obvious. But a consistent time in his word, through the prompting of his Spirit, through godly counsel, God answers those prayers when we bring those things to him. And so let's not default to our wisdom. Let's trust in the Lord with all our heart. Let's not lean on our own understanding. Let's acknowledge him in everything and allow him to direct our paths. Okay, so hopefully some good encouragement that way tonight. There's a number of things there that we can be praying for this evening as we go to prayer, and I would encourage you to do that. Direction for Marty as he's still looking for work. Direction for us as a church as far as ministry assistant is concerned. A direction for you fill in the blank for Awana as we have a need for a Sparks director. Direction for us as a church as we consider future opportunities with global partnering. And you fill in the blank, the list goes on and on, right? We need the Lord to answer. We need the Lord to steer us exactly where he wants us to be. One of the prayers we'll look at later on this fall, direction for how we should raise our children. I mean, it comes down to the very nitty-gritty things of life, right? Asking for the Lord to lead us in every decision, in every situation that we face. And so let's go to him tonight, asking him to provide that sense of understanding. So we're going to split into groups tonight. We're going to do it again by section, kind of where you're seated. And so if you've got a large group section and you want to split it into two, you're welcome to do that. But we've kind of got a section here. We've kind of got a section here in these two. We got a section back there. We've got a section here. I would encourage you to go to prayer within those groups. And let's praise the Lord for who he is. Let's thank him for what he's provided.